Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College, and I'm pleased to have all of you here today. Welcome back from spring break. One of the things that I did when I was on spring break is I attended a conference in Philadelphia for the Medieval Academy of America, and I had letters on the mind, so I was never too far away from the lecture series. In between sessions, I went to the Free Library of Philadelphia, and one of the things that I did was look at original autographed manuscripts of Edgar Allan Poe. So I spent part of my break reading letters. To some of you, that may not be exciting, but for someone who's a literary historian, that is like the bread and butter of what we do. So I'm glad to be back with all of you today and see all of you here in class. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, someone whom I have known now for over 30 years, I think 32 years. Dr. Douglas Murray is professor of English at Belmont University. He's a native of North Carolina and attended Pfeiffer College and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He began teaching at Belmont in 1987. And that's when we first met each other. He is one of the most talented people I know. And he is partly responsible for me being here today. And I certainly owe him much in terms of my intellectual development and my aesthetic appreciation and my advancement in music. He's someone who is passionate about what he does, loves literature, and I'm sure that he's had that same effect on other people throughout the years. He's published on English hymnody, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, Jane Austen, and Francis Trollope. He worked with Margaret Ann Doody on Catherine and other writings. They co-edited the collection for Oxford University Press a number of years ago. He's also an organist. A gifted musician. He plays at Nashville's Second Presbyterian Church. And many years ago, we used to sing together at Christ Church Cathedral. He has participated in organ improvisation contests, having taken home second prize in the NCOI, the National Competition of Organ Improvisation, in 2014. It's very impressive. He lives in Nashville with his husband David and their 8-year-old twin daughters. And he's here today to talk to us about Jane Austen and the Me Too movement. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Murray.
Thank you, Phil, for that generous introduction. The title has expanded a bit. I'm doing that favorite English teacher technique of having a salient quotation followed by a colon and then the actual title. She could not repent her resistance. Jane Austen and the Me Too movement. I'm going to start with my favorite academic joke. I don't expect anybody to laugh. Here it is. An old professor used to include the same essay question on his final examination every semester. Someone asked him, "Professor, do you ever get bored reading year after year answers to the same question?" The teacher promptly replied with surprise and consternation, "Oh, of course not. The question might be the same every year, but each year the answers are different." This anecdote highlights one appeal of great literature. Literature is a shapeshifter, mercurial, magically transforming itself. In math, as I recall, you're encouraged to come up with the same answer each time you work a problem. But literature, not so much. A situation acknowledged by some strands of modern literary criticism. There have recently been a slew of fascinating reader response studies of how the conditions of reading and also different interpretive communities can alter interpretation. I'm thinking of Azar Nafizi's seminal Reading Lolita in Tehran, 2003, of Dominic Drumgoole, I love that name, of Dominic Drumgoole's Hamlet Globe to Globe, 2 years, 190,000 miles, 197 countries, one play, 2017, And finally, Laura Bates's Shakespeare Saved My Life, 10 Years in Solitary with the Bard, an account of teaching and reading Shakespeare in prison. We should not be surprised, then, when changing perceptions create different readings. Early in the last century, Jane Austen was a favorite of suffragettes, as in this image of a banner created in 1908 for a woman's suffrage procession. In the era before World War II, as Devaney Lucer's The Making of Jane Austen, 2017 indicates, Austen was most prized for the scenes in which women stand up to authority, as when Elizabeth Bennet tells her suitor, the Reverend Mr. Collins, to get packing. And I included one delicious quotation. I thank you again and again for the honor, this is all snark, I thank you again and again for the honor you have done me in your proposals, Elizabeth says, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart. Then, starting in the 1950s, Jane Austen became the mother of chick lit. Perhaps the apogee of that Austen was the moment in Joe Wright's Pride and Prejudice, 2005, when Mr. Darcy walks across dew-bejeweled fields, uttering words decidedly not in Austen's text. You have bewitched me body and soul, a line which appears in countless internet memes with cloying regularity. Here Austen becomes the apologist for romantics, the author of panegyrics to heteronormativity. Recently, the tide has turned, and we have Helena Kelly's Jane Austen, a secret radical, and Robert Rhodey's subversive Austen, aptly entitled Bitch in a Bonnet, reclaiming Jane Austen from the snobs, the simps, and the saps. I'm pleased that Rhodey's works, somewhat outside the scholarly mainstream, resurrect the only completely authenticated image of Austen, her sister Cassandra's unflattering, uncomfortable sketch, contrasting greatly with the image which we mostly see today, that's there on the right, a Victorianized Austen, created expressly for late 19th century audiences in 1867, all lace, frilly, girly, radiating smug self-satisfaction. I should add that I find the second, the Victorianized image to be, well, repellent, even though it is to be found on the current UK 10-pound notes. In light of this current depiction of Austen as sharp-eyed, critical, and perhaps even revolutionary, I would like to argue, at last I'm arriving at my thesis. I realize it's a bit too late to be ideal because I'm already at the top of page 3. Put your thesis at the end of the first paragraph. That requirement never goes away. At last I arrive at my thesis that Jane Austen would have understood the Me Too movement, and that the Me Too movement can find confirmation in Austen's observations, her 200-year-old cultural observations. When we look at Austen's work with the insights of the Me Too movement, we realize that her novels generally dramatize the dangers, both physical and psychological, of growing up female in a patriarchal society. To demonstrate this, I would like for us to concentrate on Northanger Abbey, Austen's earliest completed novel, ironically published last. It was published posthumously shortly after her death in 1817. Drafted in the 1790s and set in the 1790s, the novel was completed around 1803 and sold to a publisher in that year. Austen hoped that it would be her first work to see the light of print, but the publisher inexplicably sat on the manuscript for 6 years until Austen bought it back in 1809. Austen was, as you can imagine, hopping mad at how she had been treated at that 6 years lacuna, and in her correspondence with the publisher who had bought the novel, she used the pseudonym Mrs. Ashton Dennis, or M.A.D., MAD for short. The plot of Northanger Abbey is simple, and here I apologize to any true Austenians who are in the audience who know the work of Jane Austen. True Austenians know the complete works of Jane Austen better than the Baptists used to know the Bible. So I'm only going to introduce you to a few characters. Catherine Morland, a clergyman's daughter from a small village in Wiltshire, is offered a free trip to the resort spa town of Bath to accompany Mr. and Mrs. Allen, the local village's landowning wealthy family. At first, Catherine feels lonely, but she soon meets another young girl, Isabella Thorpe, and they become inseparable friends. She also meets the Reverend, I'm introducing these in the order here, she also meets the Reverend Mr. Henry Tilney, whom she is, spoiler alert, later to marry. Through Isabella, Catherine meets Isabella's brother John. So now we're at the bottom of the page. The cast expands just a bit when Catherine's brother James Morland visits Bath, and when Henry, remember the clergyman and the true love interest, when he introduces his sister Eleanor and his father, General Tilney. It is a truism of Austen criticism that Northanger Abbey has the Gothic novel on the brain. Gothic, that genre born in the 1760s, which reached a peak in the 1790s when Northanger Abbey is set. Isabella convinces Catherine to read best-selling Gothic novels, particularly the works of Anne Radcliffe, one of the two greatest English novelists whom you've never heard of. The other is Samuel Richardson. Many other characters read and discuss Gothic fiction in Northanger Abbey, even the clergyman, the Reverend Mr. Tilney, and even perhaps the non-reader John Thorpe, remember the brother of Isabella. We really can't be sure whether he has read Gothic fiction. He talks about it, but he gets some of the details wrong, so he may just be basically cribbing. Anyway, Catherine, who follows Isabella's every whim, indeed, the impressionable young Catherine sets Isabella as her lifestyle guru. She begins with The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794, and she is suitably frightened. She goes off in search of Gothic ruins and is thrilled when the Reverend Tilney and his pleasant sister Isabella and his formidable father, General Tilney, invite her to stay at their country estate, a refurbished convent named Northanger Abbey. And I just include these various photographs from the film versions of Northanger Abbey. The novel Northanger Abbey has often been interpreted, a silly work, a teen novel written by a silly girl barely out of her teens herself. However, I would like to suggest this afternoon that it is more, that it's a disturbing novel about growing up female in a confusing male-dominated culture. In this novel, as we will see, someone is always coaxing, corralling Catherine, interfering with her free exercise of will. Even though Catherine does not know it, she is often walking through very dangerous territory. But Austen, using the venerable literary device called dramatic irony, makes the alert reader sense Catherine's danger and later understand her alarm. Catherine does, as we will see, become increasingly alarmed at her situation. The first taste of danger, perhaps terror, is minor, but nonetheless real. At their first evening ball in Bath, Mr. Allen deserts his wife and young protege, Catherine, who are left in a, quote, mob by themselves. Austen was writing a mere decade after the French Revolution, which had instilled a fear of the mob in English breasts. Catherine, quite rightly fearful, quote, linked her arm firmly within her friend's, that's Mrs. Allen's arm, so that they would not, quote, be torn asunder by the chaotic crowd. Note Austen's careful word choices here, firmly suggesting Catherine's strength of resolve and her anxiety, torn asunder, recalling the very real fears which the girl experiences. It's significant that Austen never undercuts Catherine's fear, never suggests that she's merely a silly girl overreacting to a harmless situation. More dangers await Catherine, especially when she gets to know the young males of Bath. In what I sometimes call the first kidnapping scene in the novel, in Chapter 9, John Thorpe comes and claims Catherine for a carriage ride when she had made no promises to accompany him. But I'm going to concentrate on two later, quote-unquote, kidnapping scenes, each more, I think, troubling than the last. They deserve line-by-line analysis. To do so, I would like for us to adopt contemporary terminology, which I hope is going to allow a clear understanding of these events. Now for some terms and definitions. The first category I wish to establish is what I'm going to call the male lie. These lies can take one of three forms, and they're not perhaps always distinguishable from each other. The false promise, braggadocio, or simply, hyperbolic untruth, and then finally, what I'm going to call fake news. That is a story, often elaborate, completely fabricated, and deliberately manufactured in order to confuse or deceive. The next categories require less explanation. A masculine refusal to acknowledge that no means no, a demonstration of male anger and power, often through a tone of command or through discussion of or practice of arbitrary violence. Fourth, community coercion, often from enabling females who ought to link armed with their sister Catherine, but who actually end up supporting the patriarchs. Mansplaining, that is, explaining in a way which silences or belittles the female. And finally, gaslighting, lying so insidiously as to make the person lied to doubt her or his sanity. Now, I've included a certain amount of, I'm not a tech guru. I've included a certain amount of color coordination here because we're going to be going through some actual scenes, and I'm providing my list of the presence of these in various colors as we get to the scenes. Anyway, note that many of these behaviors can seem, both in real life and in fiction, like minor annoyances. However, as I hope you will agree with me, these behaviors often appear together in sinister proximity to each other, and as such function as microaggressions, signaling, I think, some serious and seriously wounding propensities. Now, let's look at the first scene. This scene occurs in chapter 11 of the novel. Catherine is sitting innocently at home, or at least in their rented lodgings with Mrs. Allen, when John Thorpe makes a hurried entrance. "Make haste! Make haste!" as he threw open the door. He's always saying, "Hurry up." He's really quite annoying. "Put on your hat this minute. There's no time to be lost. We are going to Bristol." This is the first Catherine's ever heard about this. "How do you do, Mrs. Allen?" "To Bristol? It's not that a long way off," Catherine asks, "but however, I cannot go with you today." Female refusal. "I cannot go with you today because I am engaged. I expect some friends every moment." This was, of course, vehemently talked down as no reason at all. He does not accept no for an answer. Vehemently talked down as no reason at all. Notice the word vehemently. Mrs. Allen was called in to second him, and the two others walked in, that is James Morland and Isabella, to give their assistance. "My sweetest Catherine," this is Isabella. "My sweetest Catherine, is not this delightful? We shall have a most heavenly drive. You are to thank your brother and me for this scheme. It darted into our heads at breakfast time, I verily believe at the same instant, and we should have been off 2 hours ago if it had not been for this detestable rain. But it does not signify. The nights are moonlight, and we shall do delightfully." That means they can come back with the moon shining so they'll be able to see. This is before street lights, but moonshine was a thing. I'm not talking about the stuff that one drinks, but moonshine actually coming from the moon was a thing. "Oh, I'm in such ecstasies at the thought of a little country air." Oops, I seem to have skipped a page. "So much better than going to the lower rooms. We shall drive directly to Clifton and dine there. As soon as dinner is over, if there's time for it, go on to King's Weston." "I doubt our being able to do so much," said Morland. He's not as much of a braggart. "You croaking fellow! We shall be able to do 10 times more. King's Weston, aye, and Blaise Castle too, and anything else we can hear of. But here your sister says she will not go." So this is blaming the person, blaming the victim. Blaise Castle, what's that? Well, it turns out that Blaise Castle is actually just a sham ruin. There really is nothing to it. It's just basically, you know what a Potemkin village is? It's just basically, it's like basically a billboard by the side of the road shaped like a Gothic castle. It's not a real Gothic castle. Blaise Castle, what's that? Fake facts. The finest place in England, worth going 50 miles at any time to see. What? Is it really a castle? An old castle, the oldest in the kingdom, false promise. But is it like what one reads of? Exactly the very same, false promise. But now, really, are there towers and long galleries? By the dozens, false promise. Then I should like to see it, but I cannot go. Female refusal. Not go, my beloved creature. This is clearly Isabella. Austen is really tricky here. You have to figure out from the way people talk who says what. Not go, my beloved creature. What do you mean? I cannot go, female refusal again, because, looking down as she spoke, fearful of Isabella's smile. And I notice that Isabella is kind of getting to her internally. I expect Miss Tilney and her brother to call on me to take a country walk. They promised to come at 12, only it rained. But now, as it is so fine, I dare say they will be here soon. Not they indeed, for as we turned into Broad Street, I saw them. This is, I call this more than a lie, because this is fake news. This is really not true. He's just making this up in order to get his way. Does he not drive a phaeton with bright chestnuts? Okay, it has all this corroborative detail, but nonetheless, it's not true. I do not know, indeed. Yes, I know he does. You are talking of the man you danced with last night, are you not? Yes. Well, I saw him at that moment turn down Lansdowne Road driving a smart-looking girl. Did you indeed? Did, upon my soul. Knew him again directly, and he seemed to have got some very pretty cattle, too. It is very odd. I suppose they thought it would be too dirty for a walk. So here's more fake news with detail. And well they might, for I never saw so much dirt in my life. Walk. You could no more walk than you could fly. It has not been so dirty the whole winter. It is ankle deep everywhere. Isabella corroborated it. My dearest Catherine, you cannot form an idea of the dirt. Come, you must go. You cannot refuse going now. I should like to see the castle, but may we all go over it? May we all go into every staircase and into every suite of rooms? Yes, every hole and corner. This is Thorpe, John Thorpe. But then, if they should only be gone out for an hour till it's drier and call by and by, but then he makes up another story. Make yourself easy. There's no danger of that, for I heard Tilney hallooing to a man that was just passing by on horseback that they were going as far as Wick Rocks. All right. They passed, and I'm skipping a couple of paragraphs. They passed, this is Isabella, and John Thorpe and Catherine are in the same carriage. They passed briskly down Pulteney Street and through Laura Place without the exchange of many words. Thorpe talked to his horse, and she meditated by turns on broken promises and broken arches, phaetons and false hangings, Tilneys and trapdoors. As they entered Argyle buildings, however, she was roused by this address from her companion. Who's that girl who looked at you so hard as she went by? Who? Where? And this is Thorpe. On the right pavement. She must be almost out of sight now. Catherine looked round and saw Miss Tilney leaning on her brother's arms, walking slowly down the street. She saw them both looking back at her. Stop! Stop, Mr. Thorpe! Okay, in the 18th century literature, there are plenty of carriage scenes in which women are kidnapped in carriages, and they try to stop the carriages, and they cannot get out. Stop, stop, Mr. Thorpe, she impatiently cried. It is Miss Tilney, it is indeed. How could you tell me they were gone? Stop, stop. I will get out this moment and go to them. But to what purpose did she speak? Thorpe only lashed the horse into a brisker trot. Okay, this is male anger and power. The Tilneys, who had soon ceased to look after her, were in a moment out of sight round the corner of Laura Place, and in another moment she was herself whisked into the marketplace. Still, however, and during the length of another street, she entreated him to stop. Pray stop, Mr. Thorpe. I cannot go on. I will not go on. I must go back to Miss Tilney. But Mr. Thorpe only laughed, smacked his whip, encouraged his horse, made odd noises, and drove on. And Catherine, angry and vexed as she was, having no power of getting away, was obliged to give up the point and submit. Her reproaches, however, were not spared. How can you deceive me so, Mr. Thorpe? How can you say you saw them driving up the Lansdowne Road? I would not have had it happen for the world. They must think it so strange, so rude of me to go by them so, not saying a word. You do not know how vexed I am. I shall have no pleasure at Clifton nor in anything else. I had rather, 10,000 times rather, get out now and walk back to them. How could you say you saw them driving out in a phaeton? Thorpe defended himself very stoutly. The inability to say that you've done anything wrong, declared he had never seen two men so much alike in his life, which is not true, and would hardly give up the point of its having been Tilney himself. This is the next episode that I'd like for us to look at. It takes place two chapters later, and it is in chapter 13, and what is happening here is that Catherine is once again seated in Mrs. Allen's house and once again interrupted. The Thorpes decide that they want to take another jaunt. The affair thus determined and Thorpe's approbation secured, Catherine only remained to be apprised of it. She had left them for a few minutes to speak to Miss Tilney. In that interval the plan was completed, and as soon as she came again, her agreement was demanded. But instead of the gay acquiescence expected by Isabella, Catherine looked grave, was very sorry, but could not go. The engagement which ought to have kept her from joining in the former attempt would make it impossible for her to accompany them now. She had that moment settled with Miss Tilney to take their promised walk tomorrow. It was quite determined she would not upon any account retract, but that she must and should retract was instantly the eager cry of both the Thorpes. They must go to Clifton tomorrow. This is a wonderful example of Austen's use of what's known as free indirect discourse. Even though this looks like narration, this must is a word that undoubtedly the Thorpes use. You must go with us. They must go to Clifton tomorrow. They would not go out without her. It would be nothing to put off a mere walk for one day longer, and they would not hear of a refusal. Catherine was distressed, but not subdued. "Do not urge me, Isabella. I am engaged to Miss Tilney. I cannot go." This availed nothing. The same arguments assailed her again. She must go. She should go, and they would not hear of a refusal. It would be so easy to tell Miss Tilney that you had just been reminded of a prior engagement and must only beg to put off the walk until Tuesday. No, it would not be easy. I could not do it. There had been no prior engagement. But Isabella became only more and more urgent, calling on her in the most affectionate manner, addressing her by the most endearing names. She was sure her dearest, sweetest, this is once again free indirect discourse, because undoubtedly these were the very words that Isabella was using towards Catherine. She was sure her dearest, sweetest Catherine would not seriously refuse such a trifling request to a friend who loved her so dearly. She knew her beloved Catherine to have so feeling a heart, so sweet a temper, to be so easily persuaded by those she loved. But all in vain. Catherine felt herself to be in the right, and though pained by such tender, such flattering supplication, she could not allow it to influence her. Isabella then tried another method. She reproached her with having more affection for Miss Tilney, though she had known her for so little a while, than for her best and oldest friends, with being grown cold and indifferent, in short, towards herself. "I cannot help being jealous, Catherine, when I see myself slighted for strangers, I, who love you so excessively. When once my affections are placed, it is not in the power of anything to change them. But I believe my feelings are stronger than anybody's. I'm sure they are too strong for my own peace. And to see myself supplanted in your friendship by strangers does cut me to the quick, I own. These Tilneys seem to swallow up everything else." Catherine thought this reproach equally strange and unkind. Was it the part of a friend thus to expose her feelings to the notice of others? Isabella appeared to her ungenerous and selfish, regardless of everything but her own gratification. These painful ideas crossed her mind, though she said nothing. Isabella, in the meanwhile, had applied her handkerchief to her eyes, attempting the guilt trick. And Morland, miserable at such a sight, could not help saying, "Nay, Catherine, I think you cannot stand out any longer now. The sacrifice is not much, and to oblige such a friend, I shall think you quite unkind if you still refuse." This was the first time of her brother's openly siding against her, and anxious to avoid his displeasure, she proposed a compromise. If they only would put off their scheme till Tuesday, which they might easily do, as it depended only on themselves, she could go with them. But no, was the immediate answer. This could not be, for Thorpe did not know that he might not go to town on Tuesday. Catherine was sorry. She could do no more. A short silence ensued, which was broken by Isabella, who, in a voice of cold resentment, said, "Very well, then. There's an end to the party. If Catherine does not go, I cannot." This is an attempt to shame the female through community coercion. "I cannot be the only woman. It would not, upon any account in the world. I would not do so improper a thing." "Catherine must go," said James. "But why cannot Mr. Thorpe drive one of his other sisters? I dare say either of them would like to go." "Thank ye," cried Thorpe, "but I did not come to Bath to drive my sisters about and look like a fool. No, if you do not go, damn me if I do. I go only for the sake of driving you. That's a compliment which gives me no pleasure. But her words were lost on Thorpe, who had turned abruptly away. The three others still continued together, walking in a most comfortable manner to poor Catherine. Sometimes not a word was said. Sometimes she was again attacked. Notice these verbs, with supplications or reproaches, and her arm was still linked within Isabella's, though their hearts were at war. At one moment she was softened, at another irritated, always distressed, but always steady. "I did not think you had been so obstinate, Catherine," said James. "You were not used to be so hard to persuade. You were once the kindest, best-tempered of my sisters." "I hope I'm not less so now," she replied. "But indeed I cannot go. If I'm wrong, I'm doing what I believe to be right." "I suspect," said Isabella in a low voice, "there's no great struggle." Catherine's heart swelled. She drew away her arm, and Isabella made no opposition. They passed a long 10 minutes till they were again joined by Thorpe, who, coming to them with a gayer look, said, "Well, I have settled the matter, and now we may all go tomorrow with a safe conscience. I have been to Miss Tilney and made your excuses." So notice that he has put words in the female's mouth. "You have not," cried Catherine. "I have, upon my soul, left her this moment. Told her you had sent me to say that, having just recollected a prior engagement of going to Clifton with us tomorrow, you could not have the pleasure of walking with her till Tuesday. She said very well. Tuesday was just as convenient to her. So there's an end to all our difficulties. A pretty good thought of mine, hey?" Isabella's countenance was once more all smiles and good humor, and James, too, looked happy again. "A most heavenly thought, indeed. Now, my sweet Catherine, all our distresses are over." "This will not do," said Catherine. "I cannot submit to this. I must run after Miss Tilney." So notice that she's looking for physical escape. "I must run after Miss Tilney directly and set her right." Isabella, however, caught hold of one hand, Thorpe of the other, and remonstrances poured in from all three. Even James was quite angry. When everything was settled, when Miss Tilney herself said that Tuesday would suit her as well, it was quite ridiculous, quite absurd to make any further objection. These are Isabella's thoughts and words. "I do not care. Mr. Thorpe had no business to invent any such message. If I had thought it right to put off, I would have spoken to Miss Tilney myself. This is only doing it in a ruder way. And how do I know that Mr. Thorpe has? He may be mistaken again. Perhaps he led me into one act of rudeness by his mistake on Friday. Let me go, Mr. Thorpe. Isabella, do not hold me." Thorpe told her it would be in vain to go after the Tilneys. They were turning the corner into Brook Street when he had overtaken them, and they were at home by this time. "Then I will go after them," said Catherine. "Wherever they are, I will go after them. It does not signify talking. If I could not be persuaded into doing what I thought wrong, I will never be tricked into it." And with these words, she broke away and hurried off. Thorpe would have darted after her, but Morland withheld him. Let her go, if she will go. She's as obstinate as—" Thorpe never finished the simile, for it could hardly have been a proper one. Away walked Catherine in great agitation, as fast as the crowd would permit her, fearful of being pursued, yet determined to persevere. Nevertheless, she persisted. As she walked, she reflected on what had passed. It was painful to her to disappoint and displease them. She has this internalized fear of having violated the community standards, particularly to displease her brother. But, and this is where my title comes from, she could not repent her resistance. Well, at any rate, I don't know how you're doing with this. I'll be eager to find out how persuaded you are of my analysis. But wait, there's more. I haven't left much time to investigate mansplaining and gaslighting, but I do want to do so rather, I hope, efficiently. The modern term gaslighting derives from a play, and particularly from a 1944 film that was apparently very popular. In it, Charles Boyer plays with the mind of Ingrid Bergman. Through lying, through making her doubt her perceptions and memory, he tries to convince her that she's going insane. He keeps turning down the gaslight. And she says, there's something wrong with the light in here. Isn't it getting dim? And he convinces her that she's going blind by telling a lie over and over again. At any rate, I take the modern definition of gaslighting from the trendiest of sources, UrbanDictionary.com. a form of intimidation or psychological abuse, sometimes called ambient abuse, where false information is presented to the victim, making them doubt their own memory, perception, and quite often their sanity. The term achieved currency in 2016 when it was used in a political or editorial in, of all places, Teen Vogue. It is a word, alas, whose time has come, for we're always being bombarded by misleading information, a situation that Austen depicts in Northanger Abbey. John Thorpe gaslights Catherine throughout Volume 1 of the novel. He deliberately provides her with misleading information about distances, about what time it is, about milestones, and then at a ball, he all of a sudden appears to tell Catherine that they are engaged to dance. I didn't make a copy of this text, so you'll have to listen carefully, but there's not much of it. Note that he accompanies his misinformation with detailed recollections that are completely fabricated. Another version of fake news. Scarcely, what's happening is this. Catherine and Henry Tilney have been engaged to dance, and they're getting ready to do a country dance. And in country dancing, the partners line up, okay, before they actually do the dancing. So Catherine and Henry Tilney are standing in line, waiting to be part of the dance. Scarcely had they, Catherine and Henry Tilney, worked themselves into the line of couples waiting to join the country dance, when Catherine's attention was claimed by John Thorpe, who stood behind her. "Heyday, Miss Morland," said he. "What is the meaning of this? I thought that you and I were to dance together." Catherine responds, "I wonder you should think so, for you never asked me." "That's a good one, by Jove. I asked you as soon as I came into the room, and I was going to ask you again, but when I turned round, you were gone. This is a cursed shabby trick. Yes, I remember. I asked you while you were waiting in the lobby for your cloak." In the past, readers noted how this scene reveals Thorpe's boorishness. But in the Me Too era, his fabrication, his textbook perfect practice of gaslighting, reveals itself to be part of a sinister ideology of toxic masculinity. I used to find scenes such as I've just been examining. You may be having a certain amount of Austen exhaustion, but this is basically the last of my scenes of Austen. I encourage you to read the novel. I used to find these scenes amusing, but not particularly compelling. But our culture has become more and more aware of how we can make the powerless feel. And now I experience Catherine's genuine confusion, her fear of having her volition taken away. In this sense, Catherine recalls a Gothic hero or a Gothic heroine, somebody in immediate danger. I'm thinking, for example, of Jonathan Harker finding himself imprisoned in Dracula's castle and being gazed on longingly by the thirsty count. I'm thinking of the second Mrs. De Winter in Daphne du Maurier's novel, Rebecca, who knows that her new house is full of secrets and that she will very likely set a foot wrong. She's Wendy Torrance, who realizes that she's imprisoned in the Overlook Hotel with a madman who just happens to be her husband. Austen's point is that fear and danger are not only to be found in a crumbling medieval castle in medieval Italy, but also in the here and now, in the moments in which women find themselves resisting. Northanger Abbey, spoiler alerts, is far from a comforting novel which laughs at danger. We later learn that both John Thorpe and General Tilney have gotten hold of fake news that Catherine is an heiress, that she's very, very wealthy. Both want her supposed fortune. Isabella Thorpe is in on the plot. The main reason why General Tilney encourages his children to be so ingratiating to our heroine is that he's hoping his family can gobble up her money. The novel, despite its lighthearted tone, is a cautionary tale in which many characters behave very badly indeed. My take on this book is somewhat novel. Earlier I mentioned that Northanger Abbey has been interpreted as a silly book, as a teen novel written by a silly girl barely out of her teens herself. Before I take my leave, I would like for us to visit a foundational critic in Austen studies and look closely at his influential take on the young Catherine. I think you might find something eerily familiar in what I'm about to share. The critic that I've chosen is Marvin Mudrick, whose Jane Austen, Irony as Defense and Discovery, 1952, is still cited and highly regarded. Mudrick tells us that Catherine has a lightweight mind, that she finds no iniquity in Bath, that John Thorpe may be unwelcome, but, and these are Mudrick's words, there's nothing sinister about him. Mudrick continues, we can never believe that Catherine or her troubles are of much moment. Catherine is never allowed to display a sensitivity that might engage our sympathy. Mudrick's words, written in 1952, recall some responses that I've heard to Me Too complaints. People in power often repeat litany-like the same words. Your troubles are not of much moment. Though your experience might have been unpleasant, we find no iniquity in Nashville or Murfreesboro. Stop complaining. The one you complain about, deep down, is a good guy. You and your concerns are lightweight. So, Austen might look different in the age of Me Too. I see the author and the social movement embracing each other, the movement providing the conceptual tools which allow us to read Austen's novels differently, and Austen affirming the validity of these concepts. Before we part this afternoon, let's return to my initial joke, the story of the old professor who loved shifting mercurial answers, unstable answers. His comment raises a philosophical issue. Is there a real unitary Jane Austen underneath and behind all these varied interpretations of her identity? I would like, audaciously perhaps, to attempt to answer this question in an old-fashioned, untheoretical way. First, I want to broaden the question. Do individuals, do you, does Professor Phillips, do we have stable selves, continuing personalities that last from crib to deathbed? In more highfalutin terms, do any of us possess ontological continuity? One of the Enlightenment's patron saints, John Locke, argued yes. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke claimed that our combination of sensory impressions creates our abiding and unique personalities. Nowadays, the behaviorist, postmodern, and materialist take is less secure, arguing that individuals possess no stable personalities. But what if great writers and beautiful people like ourselves express our unchanging essence differently as the circumstances around us change? The real Dr. Phillips is always there, manifesting himself in different ways every decade. I've seen many different Phils, but I believe they all display the same Philness deep down inside. This works for me, but now the task is yours. I hope you like Jane Austen now, and I hope that if you like her, you will reread her every decade for the next 40 years. But I suspect that every time you reread her, she will be different. Return to your favorite composers. Return to your favorite movies. Return to your favorite books every decade so that you can discover how you and how they have changed. I got through that without a cough.
We do have a few minutes for questions or comments, so anyone from the audience.
Yes.
I may not be as familiar as her main character as you are, but if she...
I'll get them confused.
Okay. If she herself was able to live and die as a single successful woman, even in her time period, then how come she never really gave us a main character that did the same? She gave us some really strong ones. I'm a particular fan of Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, this is fascinating, and well, go ahead and finish your question. Yeah.
I've always admired the character Elizabeth Bennet for her wit and her just distinct lack of care to save her mind.
It is interesting that she's always finding herself having trouble. I do think that my analysis works very, very well with Northanger Abbey. Perhaps less well with Pride and Prejudice, but she does have trouble when she says no. People have trouble accepting that her no really means no. And I find that to be really quite fascinating in Pride and Prejudice. Now, you've asked a fascinating question. I was lucky enough, as Professor Phillips mentioned, I was lucky enough to spend a large period of my life working with Jane Austen's earlier works, the works that sometimes are called the juvenilia, which suggests something that's juvenile. It's not very significant. There are a lot of quite vocal and quite mobile and quite strong-willed characters there. It's interesting that when Austen chose to write, I think that she was trying to negotiate. She was very eager to get in print. And so she was very eager to figure out a way of including what I consider to be some quite radical messages that are in some ways disguised within the Trojan horse of what looks like a romantic novel. So I mean, I think in some ways she oftentimes had to be really sort of sly and indirect sometimes when she was giving these portraits of strong femininity. This continues to be a story in the English novel. I've just been teaching Jane Eyre, and there's a wonderful section in Jane Eyre, you might remember, where Mr. Brocklehurst comes up with all this argument for why the girls at Lowood School shouldn't have really good food. And it turns out that the exact same arguments were being voiced in Parliament about the Irish during the potato famine. And some people have argued that Charlotte Bronte felt that she couldn't comment directly, she couldn't satirize Parliament directly in her work, but she did this indirectly by sort of repurposing and recycling some of the bad arguments that she had seen. So I encourage you to read Austen as if it's sort of has a sort of secret code in it.
So in essence, what you're saying is she wrote lots of very strong female characters like Elizabeth Bennet, but to make her novels accepted into the society that she was writing her books for, to get published, her characters had to do the sociable thing and get married.
She had to I think she had to tame some of her own opinions. And if you look at the marriages, I think she sees, this is very fascinating. I mean, there are multiple ways of looking at the marriages at the end of Austen novels. And one of the popular ways, exemplified in that You Have Bewitched Me Body and Soul, is to look at Austen through the lens of romantic novels. But if you look at the but if you look at Pride and Prejudice, you'll see that Elizabeth admires Darcy, and she learns to like Darcy, the main character, because she finds out that he is the center of this really vibrant community at Pemberley. She goes to Pemberley and she sees how he can be hospitable to her relatives. He sees how Mr. Darcy has been good to his sister. She hears these stories about Mr. Darcy being a wonderful person to work for, and it's sort of that Darcy as a public figure whom she admires, and she sort of wants to join that world of Pemberley. So, I mean, I see her as being not exactly a romantic, but somebody who's just sort of aware of the social implications of people's decisions. I have probably not answered your question to your complete satisfaction, but anyway, it's a valiant attempt.
Whether you did or not, I've still enjoyed your answer, so.
Yes.
How would you advise us to go and read more traditional literature like Jane Austen with these new eyes, with modern context?
Well, first of all, I love that question, and I do not know the answer. When Professor Phillips, first of all, I teach at Belmont University, and we have what I consider to be a very heavy teaching load. And I have twin daughters, and I have a second job, so I just don't have all that much free time. So I thought, I'll write a paper about Jane Austen and the Me Too movement. Sometimes when I do big lectures like this, I consider this to be quite an honor. Sometimes when I do big lectures like this, I do what Margaret Ann Duty does, and I recycle something that I've already given that I'm completely confident of. This is the first outing of this idea. And I kind of liked my, admittedly, I now realize that I should have done just one of those scenes and not two, but anyway, live and learn. But I think my analysis, just going through and looking at the patterns of female resisting and looking at the sort of rhetoric that the males use and the rhetoric that the enablers use, I would just suggest, number one, testing out my categories, and number two, if you come up with other categories, send me an email, because I plan to do some more thinking about this. Okay? Yeah. That probably didn't answer the question.
Oh, no, it did. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Fortunately, we have Phil Phillips in the room, and Phil Phillips knows everything. So if there's a question I can't answer, I can always refer it to our Phil.
But you would be kind enough to stay afterwards in case people have individual questions.
Yes, I would, and especially if people have some suggestions or even disagreements. I'm happy to hear. That was very clever, Professor Murray, but I'm not convinced. Tell me that too.
All right, thank you very much.